Okay, chapter 15. Later, they have a house in the Hollywood Hills and a Pomeranian who shines like a little ghost when Miranda calls for her at night, a white smudge in the darkness at the end of the yard. There are photographers who follow Arthur and Miranda in the street, who keep Miranda forever anxious and on edge. Arthur's name appears above the titles of his own movies. Now, on the night of their third anniversary, his face is on billboards all over the continent. Tonight, they're having a dinner party, and Luli, their Pomeranian, is watching the proceedings from the sunroom, where she's been exiled for begging table scraps. Every time Miranda glances up from the table, she sees Luli peering in through the glass French doors. "Your dog looks like a marshmallow," says Gary Heller, who is Arthur's lawyer. "She's the cutest little thing," Elizabeth Colton says. Her face is next to Arthur's on the billboards, flashing a brilliant smile with very red lips. But off-screen, she wears no lipstick and seems nervous and shy. She is beautiful in a way that makes people forget what they were going to say when they look at her. She is very soft-spoken. People are forever leaning in close to hear what she's saying. There are 10 guests here tonight, an intimate evening to celebrate both the anniversary and the opening weekend figures. 2 birds with 1 stone, Arthur said, but there's something wrong with the evening, and Miranda is finding it increasingly difficult to hide her unease. Why would a 3-year wedding anniversary celebration involve anyone other than the 2 people who are actually married to one another? Who are all these extraneous people at my table? She's seated at the opposite end of the table from Arthur, and she somehow can't quite manage to catch his eye. He's talking to everyone except her. No one seems to have noticed that Miranda's saying very little. "I wish you'd try a little harder," Arthur has said to her once or twice, but she knows she'll never belong here, no matter how hard she tries. These are not her people. She is marooned on a strange planet. The best she can do is pretend to be unflappable when she isn't. Plates and bottles are being ferried to and from the table by a small army of caterers who will leave their headshots and possibly a screenplay or 2 behind in the kitchen at the end of the night. Luli, on the wrong side of the glass, is staring at a strawberry that's fallen off the top of Heller's wife's dessert. Miranda has a poor memory when she's nervous, which is to say, whenever she has to meet industry people or throw a dinner party, or especially both. And she absolutely cannot remember Heller's wife's name, although she's heard it at least twice this evening. "Oh, it was intense," Heller's wife is saying now in response to something that Miranda didn't hear. "We were out there for a week, just surfing every day. It was actually really spiritual." "The surfing?" the producer seated beside her asks. "You wouldn't think it, right? But just going out every day, just you and the waves and a private instructor, it was just a really focused experience. Do you surf?" "I'd love to, but I've just been so busy with this whole school thing lately," the producer says. "Actually, I guess you'd maybe call it an orphanage. It's this little thing I set up in Haiti last year, but the point is education, not just housing these kids." "I don't know. I'm not attached to this project or anything." Arthur is deep in conversation with an actor who played his brother in a film last year. "I've never met the guy, but I've heard through friends that he likes my work." "I've met him a few times," the actor says. Miranda tunes out the overlapping conversations to look at Luli, who's looking at her through the glass. She'd like to take Luli outside and stay in the backyard with her until all these people leave. The dessert plates are cleared around midnight, but no one's close to leaving, a wine-drenched languor settling over the table. Arthur is deep in conversation with Heller. Heller's nameless wife is gazing dreamily at the chandelier. Clark Thompson is here, Arthur's oldest friend, and the only person at this table, aside from Miranda, who has no professional involvement in movies. "I'm sorry," a woman named Tesh is saying now to Clark. "What exactly is it that you do?" Tesh seems to be someone who mistakes rudeness for intellectual rigor. She is about 40 and wears severe black-framed glasses that somehow remind Miranda of architects. Miranda met her for the first time this evening, and she can't remember what Tesh does, except that obviously she's involved in some way with the industry. A film editor, maybe? And also Miranda doesn't understand Tesh's name. Is she Tesh something or something Tesh? Or a one-namer, like Madonna? Are you allowed to only have one name if you're not famous? Is it possible that Tesh is actually extremely famous and Miranda's the only one at the table who doesn't know this? Yes, that seems very possible. These are the things she frets about. "What do I do? Nothing terribly glamorous, I'm afraid." Clark is British, thin and very tall, elegant in his usual uniform of vintage suit and Converse sneakers, accessorized with pink socks. He brought them a gift tonight, a beautiful glass paperweight from a museum gift shop in Rome. "I have nothing to do with the film industry," he says. "Oh," Heller's wife says, "I think that's marvelous." "It's certainly exotic," Tesh says, "but that doesn't narrow the field much, does it?" "Management consulting, based out of New York. New client in Los Angeles. I specialize in the repair and maintenance of faulty executives." Clark sips his wine. And what's that in English? The premise of the company by which I'm employed, Clark says, is that if one's the employer of an executive who's worthy in some way, but deeply flawed in others, it's sometimes cheaper to fix the executive than to replace him or her. He's an organizational psychologist, Arthur says, surfacing from conversation at the far end of the table. I remember when he went back to England to get his PhD. A PhD, Tesh says. How conventional. And you, she's turned to Miranda, how's your work going? It's going very well, thank you. Miranda spends most of her time working on the Station 11 project. She knows from the gossip blogs that people here see her as an eccentric, the actor's wife who inks mysterious cartoons that no one's ever laid eyes on. My wife's very private about her work, Arthur says in interviews, and who doesn't drive and likes to go for long walks in a town where nobody walks anywhere and who has no friends except a Pomeranian. Although, does anyone really know that last part? She hopes not. Her friendlessness is never mentioned in gossip blogs, which she appreciates. She hopes she isn't as awkward to other people as she feels to herself. Elizabeth Colton is looking at her again, in that golden way of hers. Elizabeth's hair is always unbrushed and always looks gorgeous that way. Her eyes are very blue. It's brilliant, Arthur says. I mean that. Someday she'll show it to the world and we'll all say we knew her when. When will it be finished? Soon, Miranda says. It's true. It won't be long now. She has felt for months that she's nearing the end of something, even though the story has spun off in a dozen directions and feels most days like a mess of hanging threads. She tries to meet Arthur's gaze, but he's looking at Elizabeth. What do you plan to do with it once it's done? Tesh asks. I don't know. Surely you'll try to publish it. Miranda has complicated feelings on the topic, Arthur says. Is it Miranda's imagination, or is he going out of his way to avoid looking at her directly? Oh, Tesh smiles and arches an eyebrow. It's the work itself that's important to me. Miranda is aware of how pretentious this sounds, but is it still pretentious if it's true? Not whether I publish it or not. I think that's so great, Elizabeth said. It's like, the point is that it exists in the world, right? What's the point of doing all that work, Tesh asks, if no one sees it? It makes me happy. It's peaceful. Spending hours working on it, it doesn't really matter to me if anyone else sees it. Ah, Tesh says, very admirable of you. You know, it reminds me of a documentary I saw last month, a little Czech film about an outsider artist who refuses to show her work during her lifetime. She lived in Praha and, oh, Clark says, I believe when you're speaking English, you're allowed to refer to it as Prague. Tesh appears to have lost the power of speech. It's a beautiful city, isn't it? Elizabeth has the kind of smile that makes everyone around her smile too, unconsciously. Ah, you've been there, Clark asks. I took a couple of art history classes at UCLA a few years back. I went to Prague at the end of the semester to see a few of the paintings. I'd read about it. There's such a weight of history in that place, isn't there? I wanted to move there. For the history? I grew up in the exurbs of Indianapolis, Elizabeth says. I lived in a neighborhood where the oldest building is 50 or 60 years old. There's something appealing about the thought of living in a place with some history to it, don't you think? So tonight, Heller says, if I'm not mistaken, is tonight the actual wedding anniversary? It certainly is, Arthur says, and glasses are raised. 3 years. He's smiling past Miranda's left ear. She glances over her shoulder, and when she looks back, he's shifted his gaze somewhere else. How did you two meet? Heller's wife asks. The thing about Hollywood, Miranda realized early on, is that almost everyone is Thea, her former colleague at Neptune Logistics, which is to say that almost everyone has the right clothes, the right haircut, the right everything, while Miranda flails after them in the wrong outfit with her hair sticking up. Oh, it's not the most exciting how we met story in the world, I'm afraid. A slight strain in Arthur's voice. I think how we met stories are always exciting, Elizabeth says. You're much more patient than I am, Clark says. I don't know if exciting is the word I'd use, Heller's wife says, but there's certainly a sweetness about them, about those stories, I mean. No, it's just, if everything happens for a reason, Elizabeth persists, as personally I believe that it does, then when I hear a story of how two people came together, it's like a piece of the plan is being revealed. In the silence that follows this pronouncement, a caterer refills Miranda's wine. We're from the same island, Miranda says. Oh, that island you told us about, a woman from the studio says to Arthur, with the ferns? So you're from the same island, and Heller now looking at Arthur. Not everyone is listening. There are pools and eddies of conversation around the table. Heller's tan is orange. There are rumors that he doesn't sleep at night. On the other side of the glass door, Luli shifts position to gain a better view of the dropped strawberry. Excuse me a moment, Miranda says. I'm just going to let the dog out. Arthur tells this story much better than I do. She escapes into the sunroom, through a second set of French doors, into the back lawn. Freedom. Outside, the quiet night, Luli brushes against her ankles and fades out into the darkness. The backyard isn't large. There's their property terraced up the side of a hill, leaves crowding in around the small launch pad of lawn. The gardener came today in preparation for the dinner party, and the air carries notes of damp soil and freshly cut grass. She turns back toward the dining room, knowing that they can't see her past their own overlapping reflections on the glass. She left both sets of doors open just slightly in order to hear the conversation, and now Arthur's voice carries into the yard. So, dinner goes well, and then the next night, he says, I'm in the Hotel Le Germain after 12 hours on set, in my room, waiting for Miranda to come by, so I can take her out to dinner again, second night in a row, just kind of semi-comatose in front of the television. There's a knock on the door, and voila, there she is again. But this time, one small difference. He pauses for effect. She can see Luli again now, following a mysterious scent at the far end of the lawn. This time, I'll be damned if the girl hasn't got all her worldly belongings with her. Laughter. The story's funny, the way he tells it. She shows up on his hotel doorstep with 2 suitcases, having walked across the lobby with such confidence that anyone would think she was a guest here. The best advice her mother ever gave her. Walk in like you own the place. She says something vague to Arthur about how she's moving into a hotel herself and perhaps he wouldn't mind if she just leaves the suitcases here while they go to dinner. But he's already in love, and he kisses her. He takes her to bed, and they don't leave the hotel at all that night. He invites her to stay a few days, and she never moves out. And now, here we are, in Los Angeles. He doesn't tell the whole story. He doesn't tell the crowd assembled at the table that when she went back to the apartment the next morning for the painting she'd decided she wanted, a watercolor left behind on the drafting table, Pablo was awake and waiting for her, drunk and weeping, and she returned to the hotel with a bruise on her face. Arthur doesn't tell them that he took her with him to the set that morning and passed her off as his cousin, that she called in sick to work and spent the day in his trailer reading magazines and trying not to think about Pablo while Arthur came and went in his costume, which involved a long red velvet cape and a crown. He looked magnificent. Every time he looked at her that day, something clenched in her chest. When he was done with work in the evening, he had a driver drop them at a restaurant downtown, where he sat across the table from her, looking very ordinary in a Toronto Blue Jays cap, and she looked at him and thought, I prefer you with a crown. But of course she would never say this out loud. 3.5 years later, in the Hollywood Hills, she stands outside in the yard and wonders if anyone at the table saw the tabloid photo that appeared the following morning, shot as they were leaving the restaurant. Arthur with his arm around her shoulder, Miranda in dark glasses, and Arthur blinded by the flash, which washed her out so mercifully that in the photo version of that moment, the bruise was erased. What a lovely story, someone says, and Arthur agrees. Arthur is pouring wine. He's raised his glass and he's toasting her. Here's to my beautiful, brilliant wife. But Miranda, watching from outside, sees everything. The way Elizabeth goes still and looks down, the way Arthur thanks everyone for coming to his home, meeting everyone's eyes except Elizabeth's, who has lightly touched his thigh under the table, and this is when she understands. It's too late, and it's been too late for a while. She draws an uneven breath. Great story, Heller says. Where is that wife of yours? Could she possibly go around to the front of the house, sneak in the front door and up to her studio unnoticed, then text Arthur and say she has a headache? She steps away from the glass toward the center of the lawn, where the shadows are deepest. From here, the dinner party looks like a diorama, white walls and golden light and glamorous people. She turns her back on it to look for Luli. The dog is nosing around in the grass, delighted by the scent at the base of an azalea bush. And this is when she hears the glass doors close behind her. Clark has come out for a cigarette. Her plan was to pretend if anyone came out here that she's looking for the dog, but he doesn't ask. He taps the cigarette box on the palm of his hand and holds out a cigarette without speaking. She crosses the grass and takes it from him, leans in when he flicks the lighter, and observes the dinner party while she inhales. Arthur is laughing. His hand strays to Elizabeth's wrist and rests there for an instant before he refills her wine. Why is Elizabeth sitting next to him? How could they be so indiscreet? Not a pretty sight, is it? She thinks of disagreeing, but something in Clark's voice stops her. Does everyone already know? What do you mean? She asks, but her voice is shaky. He glances at her and turns his back on the tableau, and after a moment, she does the same. There's nothing to be gained by watching the shipwreck. I'm sorry for being rude to your guest in there. Tesh, please don't be polite to her on my account. She's the most pretentious woman I've ever met in my life. I've met worse. She hasn't smoked in a while. Managed to convince herself that smoking is disgusting, but it's a pleasure, actually. More of a pleasure than she remembered. The lit end flares in the darkness when she inhales. She likes Hollywood best at night, in the quiet. When it's all dark leaves and shadows and night-blooming flowers, the edges softened, gently lit screens curving up into the hills. Luli wanders near them, snuffling in the grass. There are stars tonight, a few, although most are blanked out by the haze of the city. Good luck, darling, Clark says quietly. He's finished his cigarette. When she turns, he's already re-entering the party, reclaiming his place at the table. Oh, she's just searching for the dog, she hears him say in response to a question. I expect she'll be in any moment now. Dr. 11 has a Pomeranian. She hasn't realized this before, but it makes perfect sense. He has few friends, and without a dog, he'd be too lonely. That night in her study, she sketches a scene. Dr. 11 stands on an outcropping of rock, a thin silhouette with a fedora pulled low, scanning the choppy sea, and a small white dog stands windswept beside him. She doesn't realize until halfway through drawing the dog that she's given Dr. 11 a clone of Luli. Wind turbines spin on the horizon. Dr. 11's Luli gazes at the sea. Miranda's Luli sleeps on a pillow at her feet, twitching in a dog dream. Miranda's study window looks out over the side yard, where the lawn terraces down to a pool. Beside the pool stands a lamp from the 1950s, a crescent moon atop a tall, dark pole, placed in such a way that there's always a moon reflected in the water. The lamp is her favorite thing about this house, although she wonders sometimes about the reason for its existence. A diva who insisted on permanent moonlight? A bachelor who hoped to impress young starlets? There's a brief period most nights when the two moons float side by side on the surface. The fake moon, which has the advantage of being closer and not obscured by smog, is almost always brighter than the real one. At 3 a.m, Miranda leaves her drafting table and goes down to the kitchen for a second cup of tea. All the guests except one have departed. At the end of the night, everyone was drunk but climbed into expensive cars anyway, all except Elizabeth Colton, who drank quietly, determinedly, without taking any apparent pleasure in it, until she passed out on the sofa in the living room. Clark plucked the wineglass from her hand. Arthur removed Elizabeth's car keys from her handbag and dropped them into an opaque vase on the mantelpiece. Miranda covered her with a blanket and left a glass of water nearby. I think we should talk, Miranda said to Arthur, when the last guest except Elizabeth was gone, but he waved her off and stumbled in the direction of the bedroom, said something about talking in the morning on his way up the stairs. The house is silent now, and she feels like a stranger here. This life was never ours. She whispers to the dog, who has been following her from room to room, and Luli wags her tail and stares at Miranda with wet brown eyes. We were only ever borrowing it. In the living room, Elizabeth Colton is still unconscious. Even passed out drunk, she's a vision in the lamplight. In the kitchen, 4 headshots are lying on the countertop. Miranda studies these while the water's boiling and recognizes somewhat younger and more brooding versions of 4 of the night's caterers. She puts on a pair of flip-flops in the sunroom and lets herself out into the cool night air. She sits for a while at the poolside with her tea, Luli beside her, and splashes her feet in the water to watch the moon reflection ripple and break. There's a sound from the street, a car door closing. Stay, she tells Luli, who sits by the pool and watches as Miranda opens the gate to the front driveway, where Elizabeth's convertible is parked dark and gleaming. Miranda runs her fingertips along the side of the car as she passes, and they come away coated with a fine layer of dust. The street light at the end of the driveway is a frenzy of moths. 2 cars are parked on the street. A man leans on one of them, smoking a cigarette. In the other car, a man is asleep in the driver's seat. She recognizes both men because they follow her and Arthur much more frequently than anyone else does. Hey, the man with the cigarette says, and reaches for his camera. He's about her age, with sideburns and dark hair that falls in his eyes. Don't, she says sharply, and he hesitates. What are you doing out so late? Are you going to take my picture? He lowers the camera. Thank you, she says. In answer to your question, I just came out here to see if you might have an extra cigarette. How'd you know I'd have one? Because you're in front of my house smoking every night. 6 nights a week, he says. I take Mondays off. What's your name? Jeevan Chaudhry. So, do you have a cigarette for me, Jeevan? Sure, here. I didn't know you smoked. I just started again. Light? So, he says once her cigarette's lit, this is a first. She ignores this, looking up the house. It's pretty from here, isn't it? Yes, he says. You have a beautiful home. Was that sarcasm? She isn't sure. She doesn't care. She's always found the house beautiful, but is even more so now that she knows she's leaving. It's modest by the standards of people whose name appear above the titles of their movies, but extravagant beyond anything she would have imagined for herself. In all my life, there will never be another house like this. You know what time it is? He asks. I don't know, about 3 a.m.? Maybe more like 3:30? Why is Elizabeth Colton's car still in the driveway? Because she's a raging alcoholic, Miranda says. His eyes widen. Really? She's too wasted to drive. You didn't hear that from me. Sure, no, thank you. You're welcome. You people live for that kind of gossip, don't you? No, he says, I live on that kind of gossip, actually, as in it pays my rent. What I live for is something different. What do you live for? Truth and beauty, he says, deadpan. You like your job? I don't hate it. She is dangerously close to tears. So you enjoy stalking people? He laughs. Let's just say the job fits with my basic understanding of what work is. I don't understand. Of course you don't. You don't have to work for a living. Please, Miranda says. I've worked all my life. I worked all through school. These past few years are an anomaly. Although as she says this, she can't help but think of Pablo. She lived off of him for 10 months, until it became clear that they were going to run out of money before he sold another painting. In the next version of her life, she decides she will be entirely independent. Forget it. No, really, I'm curious. What's your understanding of work? Work is combat. So you've hated? Yeah. So you've hated every job you've had? Is that what you're saying? Jeevan shrugs. He's looking at something on his phone, distracted, his face lit blue by the screen. Miranda returns her attention to the house, the sensation of being in a dream that will end at any moment, only she isn't sure if she's fighting to wake up or to stay asleep. Elizabeth's car is all long curves and streaks of reflected light. Miranda thinks of the places she might go now that Los Angeles is over, and what surprises her is that the first place that comes to mind is Neptune Logistics. She misses the order of the place, the utter manageability of her job there, the cool air of Leon Permont's office suite, the calm of the lake. Hey, Jeevan says suddenly, and as Miranda turns, the cigarette halfway in her mouth, the flash of his camera catches her unaware. 5 more flashes in quick succession as she drops the cigarette on the sidewalk and walks quickly away from him, enters a code into a keypad and slips back in through the side gate. The after image of the first flash floating across her vision. How could she have let her guard down? How could she have been so stupid? In the morning, her picture will appear in a gossip website. Trouble in Paradise? Amid rumors of Arthur's infidelity, Miranda wanders the streets of Hollywood at 4 a.m., crying and smoking. And the photograph. The photograph. Miranda alone, in the small hours of the morning, with obvious tears in her eyes, pale in the flash, her hair standing up, and a cigarette between her fingers, lips parted, a bra strap showing where her dress has slipped. But first, there is the rest of the night to get through. Miranda closes the gate and sits for a long time on the stone bench by the pool, shaking. Luli jumps up to sit beside her. Eventually, Miranda dries her eyes and they go back to the house where Elizabeth is still sleeping, and upstairs where Miranda stops to listen outside the bedroom door, Arthur snores. She opens the door to his study, which is the opposite of her study, which is to say, the housekeeper's allowed to come in. Arthur's study is painfully neat. 4 stacks of scripts on the desk, which is made of glass and steel. An ergonomic chair, a tasteful lamp. Beside the lamp, a flat leather box with a drawer that pulls open with a ribbon. She opens this and finds what she's looking for. A yellow legal pad, on which she's seen him write before. But tonight there's only an unfinished fragment of Arthur's latest letter to his childhood friend. Dear V, strange days. The feeling that one's life resembles a movie. Thinking a lot of the future. I have such... Nothing else. You have such what, Arthur? Did your phone ring mid-sentence? Yesterday's date at the top of the page. She puts the legal pad back exactly as she found it, uses the hem of her dress to wipe a fingertip smudge from the desk. Her gaze falls on the gift that Clark brought this evening, a paperweight of clouded glass. When she holds it, it's a pleasing weight in the palm of her hand. It's like looking into a storm. She tells herself as she switches off the light that she's only taken the paperweight back to her study to sketch it, but she knows she's going to keep it forever. When she returns to her study, it's nearly dawn. Dr. Levin, the landscape, the dog, a text box for Dr. Levin's interior monologue across the bottom. After Lonigan's death, all of life seemed awkward to me. I'd become a stranger to myself. She erases and rewrites. After Lonigan's death, I felt like a stranger. The sentiment seems right, but somehow not for this image. a new image to go before this one, a close-up of a note left on Captain Lonigan's body by an undersea assassin. We were not meant for this world. Let us go home. In the next image, Dr. 11 holds the note in his hand as he stands on the outcropping of rock, the little dog by his boots, his thoughts. The first sentence of the assassin's note rang true. We were not meant for this world. I returned to my city, to my shattered life and damaged home, to my loneliness, and tried to forget the sweetness of life on earth. Too long, also melodramatic. She erases it and writes in soft pencil. I stood looking over my damaged home and tried to forget the sweetness of life on earth. A sound behind her. Elizabeth Colton leans in the doorway, holding a glass of water with both hands. I'm sorry, she said. I didn't mean to disturb. I saw the light was on in here. Come in. Miranda is surprised to realize that she's more curious than anything. A memory of the first night at the Hotel Les Germains in Toronto, lying beside Arthur, the awareness of a beginning. And now, here's the ending. Standing in her doorway, half drunk, legs like pipe cleaners in her skinny jeans, tousled and in disarray, smudges of mascara under her eyes, a sheen of sweat on her nose, but still beautiful. Still one of the finest specimens of her kind in Los Angeles, in a way Miranda knows she will never be. Never will be. No matter how long she stays here or how hard she tries. Elizabeth steps forward and sinks unexpectedly to the floor. By some small miracle, she's managed not to spill the water. I'm sorry, she says. I'm a little wobbly. Aren't we all? Miranda says. But as usually happens when she tries to say something funny, her audience seems not to catch the joke. Elizabeth and the dog are both staring at her. Please don't cry, she says to Elizabeth, whose eyes are shining. Don't, really, I'm serious, it's too much. I'm sorry, Elizabeth says for the third time, that infuriatingly small voice. She sounds like a different person when she's in front of a camera. Stop apologizing. Elizabeth blinks. You're working on your secret project. She is looking all around the room. She falls silent, and after a moment, Miranda succumbs to curiosity and sits on the floor beside Elizabeth to see the room from her vantage point. Paintings and sketches are pinned to the walls. Notes on structure and chronology cover a massive board. There are 4 pages of story outlines taped to the windowsill. What happens next? Miranda asks. It's easier to talk to Elizabeth when they're sitting side by side, when she doesn't have to look at her. I don't know. You do know. I wish I could tell you how sorry I am, Elizabeth says, but you've already told me to stop apologizing. It's just an awful thing to do. I don't think I'm an awful person, Elizabeth says. No one ever thinks they're awful, even people who really actually are. It's some sort of survival mechanism. I think this is happening because it was supposed to happen, Elizabeth speaks very softly. I'd prefer not to think that I'm following a script, Miranda says, but she's tired. There's no sting in her words. It's past 4 a.m. and too late in every sense. Elizabeth says nothing, just pulls her knees close to her chest and sighs. In 3 months, Miranda and Arthur will sit in a conference room with their lawyers to work out the final terms of their divorce settlement while the paparazzi smoke cigarettes on the sidewalk outside, while Elizabeth packs to move into the house with the crescent moonlight by the pool. In 4 months, Miranda will be back in Toronto, divorced at 27, working on a commerce degree, spending her alimony on expensive clothing and consultations with stylists because she's come to understand that clothes are armor. She will call Leon Provant to ask about employment, and a week later she'll be back at Neptune Logistics in a more interesting job now, working under Leon in client relations, rising rapidly through the company until she comes to a point after 4 or 5 years when she travels almost constantly between a dozen countries and lives mostly out of a carry-on suitcase. A time when she lives a life that feels like freedom and sleeps with her downstairs neighbor occasionally but refuses to date anyone, whispers, I repent nothing, into the mirrors of 100 hotel rooms from London to Singapore, and in the morning puts on the clothes that make her invincible, a life where the moments of emptiness and disappointment are minimal, where by her mid-30s she feels competent and at last more or less at ease in the world, studying foreign languages in first-class lounges and traveling in comfortable seats across oceans, meeting with clients and living her job, breathing her job, until she isn't sure where she stops and her job begins, almost always loves her life, but is often lonely, draws the stories of Station 11 in hotel rooms at night. But first, there's this moment, this lamplit room. Miranda sits on the floor beside Elizabeth, whose breath is heavy with wine, and she leans back until she feels the reassuring solidity of the doorframe against her spine. Elizabeth, who is crying a little, bites her lip, and together they look at the sketches and paintings pinned to every wall. The dog stands at attention and stares at the window, where just now a moth brushed up against the glass, and for a moment, everything is still. Station 11 is all around them.